Okay, let's put all of this theory together by building up a report layout. So where I left off from the previous demonstration is that we have our sales by product report. We've referenced the shared AdventureWorks DW shared data source, and I've created a data set called DSMain that brings in these fields of interest. So how I would commence here is by right-clicking in a blank area, I insert a page header. I want this to repeat on every page. From my text box, or rather toolbox, I'm going to pin this in. I want this to be open permanently. And during report design, you're referring to it so often that I typically want it there. Let me take the text box and drag it into the top, which is my report header, and then I reposition it. And then what I do in here is I say, well, I want the report name. And sure, I could type this in, but that's actually not a best practice. And let me explain why. That when you publish this report to the server, someone with adequate permissions can rename the report. And if they rename the report and someone executes it, there's confusion as to why the rendered report has a different title. So the recommendation here is not to hard code the report name, but from your report data pane and the built-in fields, use the report name. Whatever the published report name is will be used there dynamically. And then what I'll do is I'll take this text box, we'll make it somewhat wider. The formatting properties of the text box are more conveniently provided up here on the toolbar. So let's make this about 22 point. And I'll also put a bottom border on it. And because the data I have represents 2007 Q1, I think it's important that we convey that to the report reader. So I introduce a second text box and I just put a constant value in there that says 2007 Q1. Great. And now to introduce the data from my data set, I'll bring in the table. So I drop this into the body of the report and I reposition it to the top left corner. It is very, very convenient because the template here says, well, you have a header of the table and a detail row. All right, and 3 columns. So all you need to do is hover over the text box here in the detail row. When you select this little field list, there's your fields. So let's put the product name there, and it introduces the product name here in the title, or in the header rather, and then we'll put the sales here. Now the reality is, if I right-click in this text box and say, show me the expression, it is using the fields collection, the product field, and the value property of that field. But because that's often too wide to show you in a single text box, it uses this shorthand notation of square brackets. That simply means it's the value of the product field. What we see up here with an ampersand says it's a built-in field called report name. Let's preview and inspect the design of our report so far. So remember, this is not using the report server. This happens all locally inside Visual Studio. So we could be disconnected from a report server while we're developing our reports. And there we get to see what the report looks like so far. So there's clearly some work to be done to make this somewhat professional. So I switch back to design because what I want to do is format my header. I need a wider column for product, and the sales value should be formatted appropriately. So the first thing I do is select the entire header row, and this way I multi-select all text boxes in the header. And I'm going to say let's make them bold and with a background color of grey. To make this column wider, it's very simple. Just make it wider. Selecting my second column, let's justify to the right. And then to format the values here, just right-click the text box properties, and very much like Excel, having these dialog windows that allow you to come in and say, well, the number really should be no decimal places, and use that 1000 separator. And now when we preview, we see a much better layout of the report. Now I went to the effort of introducing category and subcategory, so this will allow me to build up some dynamic groupings on the rows. So to introduce that, we have a grouping pane down here. So for the currently selected data region, these are the groups that apply. There is a detail group, and I'm going to modify this group. Presently, at detail level, it represents each individual row coming back from the data set. Now, the reality is with my data set is that I've brought back the month number of year, and I want to aggregate the months to the quarter level. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say bring in an expression here that aggregates. What are we going to aggregate to? Let me remind myself. So the data set here brings back this data. So for each product, we get a month number and the sales. What I want to do is aggregate to the quarter level. So what we're really grouping on is product key. In which case, note what happens when I select this. Again, it says, well, you have to, if you want to aggregate to the detail level, which you're now saying is product level, it represents the sum of sales within the product. So selecting a field now when the grouping detail level is not the lowest level means it has to use an aggregate function. The sum of my value property of the sales field. When we preview, you don't see anything different at this stage, but it does represent the sum of all months within the first quarter of 2007. And then what I do is I say, I want subcategory. Let me drag that field on top of this group to create a nested grouping from subcategory to the product. And then I can do likewise for the category. And note the introduction of these additional columns here for category and subcategory. And this is what it looks like. There's our category, within the category the subcategory, then the product, and the sales for that product. And this is a classic example of a tablex, this very flexible grid layout. Okay, to introduce subtotals, let's right-click the subcategory here and say add a total. And there is the total for the subcategory. So that really represents the total of the category. When I right-click and come to its expression, let's build up an expression that says equals total, and using the concatenation operator with the ampersand, come to my fields and bring in the category field name. And note the shorthand notation that there's a complex expression in there uses this notation. And I can do the same for the category. To get the grand total, let's go ahead and add the total in. In which case I'm going to call this simply grand total. Now what I typically do is I select these rows and make them bold so they appear different from the detail row. Let's take a look. Accessories, helmets, locks, pumps, total accessories. We've dynamically built up the text of that text box. And if we come to the last page of the report, there I have my grand total of $5 million. Okay, so a couple of things that I want to do here. The third column that I had here, I'm going to label trend. And we'll just center that. And what I'm going to place in this column for the detail row is a sparkline, because I have the 3 months of the quarter in there. So I want to show a trend for within that quarter for that product, what the sales have been. So when I drag the sparkline in, it then says, well, how do you want that represented? And I say, you know what? This one here looks pretty cool. And then I select it, and it says, well, what value are you plotting? Sales. And now when we preview, we get to see the trends over the months. Perhaps for 3 months and a quarter that's not very effective, but you can appreciate 6 or 12 data points in there. It's really cool at a glance to be able to see where the sales have been heading for that product. Some other nice things that we can do here, a company logo. So in my report data pane, I can introduce an image. Now this is an embedded image, not really a recommended practice, but for my demo today, I have the AdventureWorks logo as a JPEG. So note the support for JPEGs, GIFs, PNGs, BMPs. So that then embeds the image into the report, and then I can drag it into the layout of my report. There we go. Let's introduce some page numbering. So I'll introduce the page footer for the report, make the body a little bit less, and again a text box. Right-click expression equals page, and then concatenate from my built-in fields, and I simply double-click page number, and it injects the built-in field expression, and I keep building up the string to then bring in total of pages. Our report evolves to look like this. Page something of 2. Did I miss something there? Page, not page name, page number. That's better. Okay, last thing that I want to introduce in here is conditional formatting. So for any product sales amount that's less than $5,000 for the quarter, I need it to be highlighted in red. So the way that I achieve that is I select the text box that I'm concerned with, then I come to its color property. Now I could use the property window here to select a constant, but this time I'm going to say, let's use an expression to define the color here. Remember, expressions begin with the equals. And I introduce then the immediate if function, IIF. What's the expression that's being tested? Well, from my fields, double click to introduce the sales value. And by the way, I have to make that the sum, because remember, I'm really aggregating the 3 months to get the quarter. So if the sum at that scope is less than 5,000, then come to my constants, double click to introduce red, comma, double click to introduce black. And sure enough, we see that these are less than 5,000. And so they're in red. And that's how you introduce conditional formatting. It's very flexible. If you want alternating rows, every second row should be shaded grey. We would just achieve that by testing what the row number is. And if it's even, make it white. If it's not, make it grey.